Right, last time was the second in the series on climate change, and what we talked about, if you recall, was the consensus out there amongst the politicians actually globally that any temperature rise over 2 degrees is dangerous, and we're 1.2 to go before we get to 2 degrees, and at the rate we're doing emissions at the moment, it's going to take less than 100 years before 2 degrees is for certain. So the obvious question next is, well, okay, if we don't want to get up there and we know what's driving it, are the carbon emissions, how much do we have to cut our emissions by and when? So firstly, on the left-hand side of the board here, what we're talking about is what the science is telling us in terms of recommending in terms of cutting of emissions. So this is the IPCC, various IPCC reports. So it's all from a baseline of 1990. That tends to be, so we convert everything so that we can compare these numbers with that baseline. So what the science is telling us is that for developed countries, who are expected, by the way, to do more than the less developed countries, mainly because A, we can afford it, and B, we have by far the most emissions, then the guidelines are that by 2020, developed countries should have cut their emissions from 1990 levels by 25 to 40%. By 2050, by 80 to 95%, and thereafter really we should have either zero emissions, so no carbon emissions at all net, so you might have emissions but you've got forests or something to net them out, or even more preferably to get into the safe zone, which is regarded as, instead of having 450 parts per million in the atmosphere of carbon, you're back to 350 parts per million. You should be actually withdrawing carbon from the atmosphere. So that's all those sequestering sort of technologies that we can talk about in a future whiteboard session. So those are the scientific guidelines. Now how do they compare to what New Zealand politically has committed to, and say what the EU has committed to? So firstly, by 2020, New Zealand has committed to a 5%. So not 25 to 40 reduction, but a 5% reduction. The next number, for which the scientists haven't actually given us a guideline, but the politicians are into, which is what's coming up in Paris, with this trying to get consensus, is that the EU by 2030 have committed politically to reducing their emissions by 40%, which is pretty much in this sort of range, but New Zealand is going to offer 11%. And then you have the 2050 targets. Remember, the science-based one is you've got to by then have had 80 to 95% of the emissions, of a reduction from 1990, so just about stopped really, isn't it, emitting by then. New Zealand has committed to 50% by then, whereas the EU has committed to this number, to the 80 to 95%. So you can see from that comparison that New Zealand's pretty limp-wristed here. Our commitments on the political side are just a fraction really of what the science is suggesting we do, whereas the EU is pretty much committing to that. Now it's all very well to commit and say we're going to do these are our targets. But the targets aren't just going to happen naturally. You've actually got to have a plan as to how you are going to actually get these cuts in emissions. And that's a whole other story as to what are the ways that you could go about doing this, what are the ways that the countries have committed to going about this, and what are the ways that probably we will end up employing to cut these emissions. But the point from this week's whiteboard is just to illustrate that New Zealand is absolutely a laggard in terms of the political targets that we're setting, let alone the strategy to get the targets. We'll talk about the strategy in the next session.